everyone. I thought I would invite a special guest for us this month. This is my husband, Michael, and he is an ancient Near Eastern scholar. He's recently published a book called The Liturgy of Creation, and it's all about calendars in the Hebrew Bible. So Michael is really familiar with the moon and what ancient cultures thought about the moon and how they used it as their calendar, how they connected it to their agriculture. And I thought you might like to hear from him this month too, and we could discuss ancient moons and how things have changed over time for our connection to moons. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here.
We are excited to have you tell us just how did people in the ancient Near East see the moon? How was it important to them?
The moon was very important in ancient Asian society. They wouldn't really have thought in the scientific ways we think, what is the moon made out of and that sort of thing. But they would recognize its importance to the cadences of life and to their own livelihood and agricultural work, and so they would see it as part of just the whole essence of power and of life-giving, and would have attributed divine essence to it. I mean, it's up there in the heavens, it goes through its cycles in the heavens above, so they would have seen it as having divine importance. Some societies would have viewed it as actually being a god, and others would see it as an eminence of divine power.
Okay, so I've been thinking about people today in our modern life and how connected they are to the moon. And I'm actually wondering if the average American even knows what a new moon is. And I know they would recognize the moon in the night sky, but that might be all that they think about it for. So how a part of their daily life was the moon? And also, what time period are we thinking about for ancient Near East? Are we thinking 2000, 5000?
Ancient Near East is generally around 3000 BC to about 500 BC, kind of from the ancient Sumerians up through the Persians. When Alexander the Great marched and conquered the Persians, kind of Greek civilization comes in with really a whole new set of ways of thinking that launched the classical era. So ancient Near East kind of ends with the arrival of the Greeks.
Okay, so we're talking about 5,000 years ago, it sounds like. What was the average person's daily experience of the moon?
Well, I mean, so when we think about time, we have clocks and we have calendars. And in the ancient Near world, there are no clocks, no calendars. The moon and the sun are their calendar and clock.
Right, because what year were clocks were invented in what century?
Well, the clock itself was only invented. I mean, Harrison's clock was invented in the 1700s. You have, sundials before that. But really, the concept of time, this is something scholars debate about a lot. In the ancient Near East, in the ancient world, you have to really step out of our own mindset. Time is not a thing in itself. We think of time as a reality that we track. We have in our mind, one sort of timeline that everything happens along. Ancient Near East, they didn't have that concept of time. They just observed processes. They're the processes of nature. They're the processes of life. And the sun and the moon and the stars track with and govern those processes. They notice that certain crops begin to grow and are harvested in connection with certain constellations in the night sky and certain cycles of the sun. And so really those divine powers in their thinking are eminences of divine life-giving are tracked by the heavenly lights. And so they really become their calendar. So they're very attuned to them and very much watching their clock and calendar.
Okay. So when do you think they first got this idea? They began to notice that the moon had a cycle. And in fact, the word month means moon.
That's right. Even in English, our word month derives from moon. because until fairly recently, historically thinking, the month really was just following the movements of the moon. It's only now that our month begins on a set day, and it really doesn't matter whether it's a new moon or a full moon or anything like that.
So in the calendars that you were studying, which is the Hebrew text, the Hebrew people were having a lunar based time thinking. I know they weren't thinking time like we are, but they were tracking the moon. The sun wasn't as much involved in their day.
So some societies were strictly lunar. Like we think the Assyrians, there's still some uncertainty about the Assyrian calendar, but they may have been just a strictly lunar calendar society. Our closest connection to that now would be the Islamic calendar. As Ramadan comes around, sometimes in the spring, sometimes it's in the winter, because the Islamic calendar follows a lunar calendar, which is just 12 lunar months. And 12 lunar months is, 354 days roughly a year, while the solar year is like 365. So there's about a 10 or 11 day difference between the two. So if you're only going by lunar months, you end up falling out of sync with the solar year.
Right.
But most ancient societies, including the Hebrews, the Babylonians, and other ancient societies, did kind of a lunisolar calendar where they tracked the months based on the moon, but about every 3 years they threw in an extra month to balance everything out. So you'd have a 12-month year, and then every 3 years you'd have a 13th month.
Okay, so that is what the Chinese still follow, this lunisolar year.
Yep.
And that's why we have the new lunar year happening in February, which many people know as the Chinese New Year. And they have the lunisolar because every 3 years they throw in that 13th
That extra month to keep things balanced.
Well, they are an ancient culture, so
That's
it
right.
kind of
They're
makes
still
sense
carrying
that they're doing that. Okay, so back to the ancient Hebrew culture and their mostly lunar cycle. The Hebrew culture did not worship the sun and moon as a god because they were taught that God, the creator, was the only God, and these were created things. So they were a little bit different from the societies around them, but they still used the moon as really the basis of their religious festivals and their religious calendar. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
So the moon literally is the month in ancient societies, Hebrew, other societies as well. The month begins when the priests make the sighting of the first sliver appearing of the new moon. And typically there'd be some sort of announcement, trumpets would be blown, bonfires lit, so forth, to announce the beginning of the new month. And that would be, in Hebrew tradition, since you're asking that one particularly, they had a new moon festival, which is like an extra Sabbath day, the first day of that new moon. And then you start to watch the moon go through its cycles, and like Passover, for example, which is in the first month of the Hebrew year, that happens after the sighting of the full moon, when you have the full moon in the middle month, the 14th of the month, and other festivals begin in cadence with new moons like that, or full moons in the middle of the month like that. But anyways, then the month ends with the disappearance of the moon, but you really don't know when the new month is going to begin until the next moon is sighted. So unlike our society, where you've got a strict 30-day, 31-day month, which falls out of sequence with the moons, they're observing their month strictly timed by the moon. The moon is what regulates the month. So you don't know if you're going to have a 29-day month or a 30-day month until the next moon appears.
So you're kind of living in uncertainty.
But you're living in cadence with the divinely appointed clock. So you're respecting the creator, you're respecting the creation, and it is telling you what the time is, unlike our society where we just pass new laws and create new calendars and new clock timings and all that.
And we're in control of everything.
And we're in control of everything.
So ancient societies kind of realized they were not in control of everything.
And think about, this is part of what's so funny to me. It seems so natural to us. When does our day begin? At midnight. I mean, that is so out of sync with nature. The day begins at sunrise, but we somehow have adopted this idea that our day begins at midnight, in the middle of the night. I mean, that's like picking up a novel and the book starts in the middle. That's just so out of sync with nature. And our months, don't align with the moon at all. It's just really, really kind of strange.
So the day began with sunrise and ended at sunset, and then the night was this sort of liminal.
So it's marginal time between days. That's right.
Okay. So the Hebrew calendar was very lunar based and very agriculture based as well, and they had their religious festivals timed with their agricultural.
That's exactly right. Yeah, because you can't have a pilgrimage festival and gather and feast when it's the middle of harvesting season.
Right.
You got to be in your fields working, so you can only take a break when it's before or after harvest, and you only have food to eat when it's after harvest. So the festivals are very much aligned with the sun, the moon, and the stars, and how those align then with the seasons, the rainy season, the harvesting season, and so forth.
Okay. So their way of viewing nature seems so different from what we have now. They were very knowledgeable about nature. They were very connected to nature. They were, in a way, I don't know what the right term would be, they were kind of submitted to the ways of nature. And then so much has happened as, I don't know, as science came along. They were following the science that they knew. More and more discoveries came, and now we have clocks, and people don't even know what a full moon is.
And we have electric lights that allow us to artificially continue our daytime on into the night. So it gives us more control, which has benefits, but obviously it has detriments too. We tend to work around the clock. In an ancient society, you really operate in cadence with the sun, so that you work from sunrise to sunset, and that means in the summer you work longer days, but in the winter you get more rest because you're working shorter days.
Right.
So there are benefits to being more in tune with nature like that.
So what kind of benefit could it have for us as modern people that we kind of have this calendar and these clocks forced on us, and we live with control of our time? What does the moon how can the moon help us be more in tune with nature?
Well, obviously we don't have the same practical need for the moon to govern our month because our society now functions by the calendars on our refrigerators or on our cell phones. But there's still that message that the moon shines day by day of just its progress. It's going from a sliver up to a full moon and then back down to recycle. And there's this whole cadence of renewal and rejuvenation that the ancient world saw not just visibly in the moon day by day and month by month, but experienced in the cadences of the seasons of dying and the seasons of new life. That really just, it's really what filled ancient society with this whole idea of life is a story of death and renewal, death and resurrection. The Egyptians had their myths of the god Osiris, who is killed by Set and then reemerges again as Horus, and this whole mythical cycle was told in cadence with their flooding of the Nile and the renewal of life in the fields. The ancient Canaanites had their Baal myth, which was the story of Baal being killed by Mot during the dry season, and then reemerging as a storm god to new life to give water to the land and renew the land. And of course, the ancient Hebrews had their story of capture and slavery in Egypt, and then the Passover and the release from Egypt, which time is springtime, and the going up into the land and receiving the harvest and bounty. So all of these ancient societies had their various religious stories and festivals that mapped with the cadences of agriculture and the sun and the moon, and visually saw with each moon that story of death and disappearance and reemergence and new life, which really all of these ancient religions and the labors of the fields and the observance of the cycles of the moon was all a way of a people participating in that story and really embracing this idea that the story of nature itself, the creation itself, is drawing us into the story of suffering and hope and renewal and life. So, in a sense, if we kind of appreciate that, we ourselves, even though our month is no longer governed by the moon, we can still benefit from that message that we see in the moon, and it reminds us that we still are participating in those cycles of seasons, and that message of hope and new life.
So maybe just growing in our own awareness of the moon and its cycles, which can be as easy as looking at the moon every night, or it's on our weather apps. You just scroll down when you're checking the temperature and it'll tell you exactly what stage the moon is at.
I've got a moon app that's so fun. It tells you exactly what stage it's at, and also gives all kinds of neat stats, how far away it is and things like that.
You have to share it because now we all want to have it.
Yeah.
I guess this could be sort of our way of being reminded that we're participating in this
cadence of
whole thing.
Yeah.
That everyone from the beginning of time has been. And in our society, it's so easy to be disconnected from that story. And I think so many people out there have forgotten. That's kind of the word. They've forgotten. Our society has forgotten this cadence, this story that we're all part of.
That's right.
So, okay. So one more thing. How is the word lunatic connected to the moon?
Well, I mean, because like even ourselves, we know you can get sunstroke from being in the sun too much. Well, in the ancient world, there were the concept that you could be, I guess you could say, moonstruck. You know, the moon would, too much exposure to the moon could make you go crazy.
Okay, so you hear that term, the lunar, in the lunatic, and that's kind of where it came from.
Which really, whether you feel that's a little bit superstitious or so forth, the point is, in the ancient world, there's a real understanding that these entities in the heavens have a direct impact on our life. Whether you go to the extreme of horoscopes or thinking of them as divine beings, or in the more monotheistic cultures to recognize them just as created elements, nonetheless they express the wisdom and the power by which we live and thrive, and so we're very connected to them. And so this idea of lunacy or sunstroke or those kinds of things are just ways of recognizing that our lives really are impacted by and connected to the heavenly lights.
It's interesting that you should say that, because as I was trying to find all of the books for our month, it's really hard to find a book about the moon that is not heavily based in either superstition or deeply connected to a religion, or it's just hard to get a general sort of moon book that's not going to scare away a certain aspect of society. There still is in our day this very interesting religious or superstitious connection to the moon. And I think that scares away some people from being more observant of the moon because they're afraid of being looked at as superstitious or overly religious or involved in something they don't want to be connected to. But going back to this whole point, that connection to the moon and observing its cycles doesn't have to be that. It just is purely understanding the whole story that we're caught up in.
That's right.
as a people and a world.
That's right.
So thank you so much for joining us this month, Michael.
Well, it's great to be part of it. I've been a big fan for a long time, and I'm glad to actually be part. It's great.
And I guess I'm just really excited that for us to think about this month, how the moon can almost be a symbol, I guess, in a way, or a representation, a reminder of how important it is for us to be connected to nature and to understand our small part in this ongoing story.
That's right.
So thanks for helping us with that.
Thank you.